It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Cameron Boyd. He works at the Northern Centre Against Sexual Assault as a counsellor advocate with people who have been sexually abused. In 2013, he completed his PhD at Deakin, looking at psychological measures for producing and shaping professional understandings of the effects of childhood sexual abuse. Cameron has worked in a range of counselling, community and research settings over the last 20 years, focusing primarily on issues affecting people who have been subjected to sexual abuse and violence. And Cameron is originally from Queensland, and it's a great pleasure to bring him back up here. He's a great colleague and great friend. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Good afternoon. I'm not going to do the typical social worker thing of telling you all to get up and have a stretch and move around, but don't let me stop you from doing that if you need to. I'd just like to acknowledge that the traditional owners of the land that we're on. Thanks to Gary and Patrick and Beth and the team for inviting me to talk today. Just to locate myself a little bit, I currently work as a counsellor advocate at the Northern Centre Against Sexual Assault in Melbourne. So we cover the northern suburbs of Melbourne, and in Victoria, in theory, every person that lives in Victoria has access to a Centre Against Sexual Assault counselling service. And it's worth noting that CASs have, although they originally started out as a women's rape crisis response kind of service, have been working with men for well over 20 years now. So there's quite a history there. And there's a paper by Carolyn Worth called The Third Wave of Service Response, so people that might be interested in the history of service development for men who've been sexually abused might like to look that paper up. I'm wanting to respond to the theme of today's forum, confronting the complexity. And I've titled my presentation Embracing Complexity, but I'll talk a little bit about why I've chosen to do that in a moment. I just want to acknowledge that I haven't developed everything here in isolation. Obviously, it's been a lot of people have contributed and helped. I'm very lucky that some men that I worked with last year in the Northern Casa men's art group have agreed. They were actually quite keen, some of them, for me to share some of their insights and comments, and also. You'll notice some of the images in the background are artworks that were produced during that group, and some of the guys were quite excited that they'd be seen by a wider audience. Also, that group was co-facilitated by Anne Riggs, who's a community artist in Melbourne, and she also took the photos. And she's done a lot of community development art projects around the world with people who've experienced trauma, so it was quite a privilege to work with her in this group. And also my Northern Casa colleagues. So just quickly, I want to talk a little bit about an orientation towards the theme of complexity, talk a little bit about working with men in the context of what's explicitly named as a feminist service. I want to talk about what safety might mean. I want to talk a little bit about some group work and individual counselling. And if I have time, which I probably won't, just responding a little bit further to the victim to offender discourse that Stephen spoke about. So these are a few thoughts about a way of responding to the theme of complexity. And it's probably fair to say this is probably a particular counsellor-y way of thinking about complexity. So the emphasis is really on holding open questions, holding open spaces to explore things that are not straightforward, and not trying to make them straightforward, not trying to simplify things, but actually engaging with people in the complexity of their lives without, there might be times when some things do become clearer, and that's helpful, but trying to always resist that move towards certainty when it's not actually called for. And this is about acknowledging the sort of vast diversity of human experiences and responses to sexual abuse, the many ways that we understand and think about the influence of sexual abuse in people's lives, sort of at a big level, theory, general kinds of thinking, but also the micro level and small complexities that this might mean in people's lives. So always being open to things we don't expect to hear. And this isn't an argument against developing knowledge or doing research or anything like that, but as we learn more and more, perhaps we need to be more and more mindful of remaining open to hearing those things that go against the dominant trends or hearing the exceptions. So that's just a general rant, really, about an orientation to the idea of complexity in the work. In terms of working in a feminist service, I would suggest there are three main benefits to locating the work in that context. One is there's quite a solid history of naming, politicising and acting on the problem of sexual abuse. I don't think it's overstating it that we probably wouldn't be having a forum like this if it wasn't for the feminist work that's been done on sexual abuse in Australia. There are areas of feminist thinking and theory that offer us a thorough, detailed examination of masculinity and the power dynamics of gender, and I would suggest that's a crucial core element of understanding that we should bring to the work. And also this, this is probably not unique to the broad school of feminism, but this sort of ongoing critical stance towards dominant practices. So it sort of brings up the question, do we actually have a dominant framework for practice in working with men who have been sexually abused? I'm not sure if we do or not. And although this work's been going on for quite a long time, there does also seem to be the sense we're in a moment where practice is developing and perhaps forming a few, some dominant ideas are forming. And I think while that's helpful, we need to, continually maintain that reflexive stance towards the work that we do and the frameworks that we draw upon. And it's something that men themselves have commented on that I've worked with. So I've worked with men who've experienced therapy in other settings, whether it's AA and NA, or we happen to be located on a veterans repatriation hospital. And some of the men I've worked with have been through treatment programs, through that stream, and have really commented on the difference they notice in the styles of therapy and the styles of group work that we do, and particularly about the relation that we as workers hold to expertise, and men actually name that they feel that in our setting, in our service, we really honour the fact that they're the experts in their lives. There are also some potential limitations, so there can be a perception that the agency is a women's service. And for a whole range of reasons, some men's experience or understanding of what feminism is may be that it's either indifferent or hostile towards men. So obviously that could present a barrier and does present a barrier for some men accessing service with us. At the same time, I'd probably suggest most service users don't really think about whether we have the service has a feminist orientation or not. It also brings up, questions around the issue of choice, and Gary was talking about the importance of choice in terms of gender of counsellor. So, in fact, everyone that contacts our service for counselling is offered a choice of whether they have a preference of whether they prefer to work with a male or female counsellor. Okay. If I have time, I'll come back to that. Okay, I want to move on to the theme of safety. How do we create safety? How do we welcome men into a space that is safe for them to do this work? So I'm going to put up a bit of a list which is not exhaustive. I'm sure I haven't thought of everything or read everything, and people will probably add things from your own experience to this list. I think would commonly be agreed that a trauma-informed perspective is important for creating safety, but I would suggest that's not the only thing. So I think some other issues might be thinking about gender and safety, about sexuality and safety. And all of these are really local and specific. So for example, men who might identify as being gay or bisexual, how do we offer a service to those men? I reckon that would look quite different where I work in Melbourne to what it might where I'm going next week in Mackay. I just think that there'd be a whole lot of specific differences around that. So I've put up a whole bunch of other things that I think are just important to illustrate the complexity of establishing safety and thinking about safety. And as obviously we heard in this address this morning, we're learning more and more about the extent of men's abuse within the care system and what that might mean about their feeling about how safe it is to access formalised support. I just wanted to name something that I'm not in a position to speak very much about, but I think it's important to name that I think we have a long way to go in addressing safety with Indigenous men in this country. We do know that a lot of Indigenous men have been subjected to sexual abuse, and we don't know enough about how to provide accessible, meaningful and safe support. And when I say we, what I'm referring to there is mainstream and government-funded services, and it's important to acknowledge at a side that there is a lot of work being done in communities across Australia that's, tackling this problem. Okay. So I want to return to that theme of safety in the context of individual trauma history. And this is, I'm just going to play a quote by one of the men in the group who agreed that it was okay to play the audio of his reflection.
I'd be interested to know what was it that enabled you to push through those first couple of sessions that were hard, to keep coming?
Logic doesn't play a big part in surviving and healing and things like that. There's a lot of what ifs, a lot of conjecture, or this is what happened in this sort of circumstance in the past, so it will happen again. And it's through people like Cameron pointing out the differences in the environment, like where we're doing it, the people around, pointing out the cold hard logic of the fact that that sort of thing isn't going to happen, and if it does, there's all these people here that are going to take very strong exception to it.
So that gives a little bit of an indication of just how much hard work and ongoing work and how active the work has to be around creating safety. This is a further quote from this. Sorry, if we pause that for a moment. And this is the same gentleman speaking again. And just want to keep in mind to how this extract leads into then thinking about gender and sexual abuse, and particularly masculinity.
You don't have to talk about abuse. You don't have to. Or anything like that. You can just talk knowing that if, for instance, it comes up, people understand, people know. So especially for me, it's being in that sort of group, you sort of don't have to actively hide it. Mm. And that to me is really important, because I have to actively hide everything all the time. Yeah.
So I just should pause to give a bit more context. I'm not sure if this made this clear. Excuse me. The interviews and the extracts that I'm referring to at the end of the 10-week group that we did with the artwork with the men, Anne and myself individually interviewed each man about their reflections of the group. And though it's important to point out that these interviews weren't sort of done with the intention of presenting in this kind of forum. It's quite, we took some care in sort of checking with each person whether they were okay with these quotes being presented, and some of them chose not to, which is which is, I think, a good sign that they were able to say they didn't want to. And others were at the other end of the continuum of saying, if there's an opportunity for this to be helpful to people, then please do, you know, use as much as you like. So I'm in quite a lucky position to be able to present that. So that the quote that's still up there is, I think, hinting a little bit about, you know, the idea of having to actively hide his own experience of abuse in just about every other context of his life, and the significance of what it means to find this space where he can meet with other men, where he doesn't have to actively hide it. So Gary touched a little bit on the complexity of gender identity. I just want to continue on with this theme. And this is another member from the group talking. It's quite a long quote. It runs over 3 slides. But I'm just going to play it, and I think it speaks for itself.
Mentioned that he was gay. And I found encouragement from that, because I thought, well, I'll just tell everyone that, yep, I lived sort of like this woman for about 5 years, really, all up. Because it was sort of like mucking about before, and it was, yeah, there and that. And that I basically changed my gender back. And I thought, well, you know, for Rosebury, getting in that area of gender and identity and sexuality, which that can be a really intense area, because once you start talking about that, you're dealing with those, because ultimately it ties back into the abuse because it's of a sexual nature. I find it so hard. It's like I went so extreme at times, as far as like living as a man. Pretty much back pretty much to how I was before I changed my gender. Changed to the female. Well, yeah. And there was things I went over the top, because there was this constant belief that I wasn't a man enough. You know, I wasn't a real man, because to abuse. So that can be confronting, dealing with those ideas and concepts. I know. So, yeah, I know how you go about it. Because that gets fundamentally down to, you know, defining who and what you are.
So obviously that's an incredibly rich quote, and I'm sure everyone will take their own, you know, meanings from that. One thing that occurs to me is, has anyone heard the idea that if you're counselling with men, you have to keep it simple? I've sort of heard that idea, that men like facts, men like concrete. I wonder just how that would go with this guy, and also how disrespectful that might be to his experience. So I want to move pretty quickly through this, because I think Gary has touched on this. In the bigger picture, on the one hand, there's a sense that gender is up for discussion in our culture, and the phrase tyranny of singularity, which I've stolen and misused, it's the title of Ron Frey's thesis. So if you're really interested in a look at how masculinity is played out in psychological and sociological theory, I'd recommend looking that up. It's through UQ, I believe. Is that right? Yeah. So at the same time as there's this sort of open discussion going on about gender and this sense that things are breaking down a little bit, men are also keenly aware about the expectations and constraints of that dominant masculinity. And just to give a stark, you know, picture about how in some ways, you know, gender equality, gender privilege, and old ideas and old order around gender is just as entrenched as ever. Yeah. So that sort of gender and cultural privilege, we just need to acknowledge it still is part of the context that we're working in. And part of that complexity is that a lot of the men we've been working with don't share in what I think it was Connell called the patriarchal dividend. They don't feel that they benefit from all those privileges. Just a nice little illustration about the other extent, the other side of that dichotomy of the opening up of gender or the breaking down of gender. This is from, you apply to go for a conference and there might be a whole bunch of areas you have to tick about your demographics. So this is taken from the registration form from a conference, I believe it's happening in the States later this year, the 13th Annual Gender Odyssey Conference. And under the gender category, you can choose from these. So obviously, a few of those categories would probably exclude who we're talking about today, but a lot of them may be relevant to the men that when we talk about working with men who've been sexually abused. So when we talk about men, when we use that word, I think we need to continue asking, well, what does that category tell us about the person we're working with? And what assumptions might it lead us into making? Okay, yeah. So just a few reflections, again, from some of the men we interviewed after the group. And this quote is really speaks to the awareness of the constraints around masculinity.
Yeah, I didn't realise people were going to have so much to say. And, it's a bit unpredictable and it's all unknown really as to how it was going to work.
Yeah.
And I think you made the comment that, when you've done similar women's groups, they haven't talked about their personal issues at all.
Yeah, they don't want to.
Yeah, whereas for us, it would appear that, it's the only chance we've ever had, and there was almost a real urgency to kind of make that happen to some degree, yeah.
Okay, so for this man, this is the only chance he's ever had to talk about this. And further, another participant put it slightly different, and I'll play this quote, but it's actually beyond his awareness that this kind of space might exist.
I think the opportunity to be in a group was very useful in and of itself, because the first time I'd come across the opportunity to be in a vent group, full stop, an abuse group, the second stop, and third stop, even having someone facilitate that. So that was beyond my experience and beyond my awareness.
Okay, I'm just going to skip through because I need to be mindful of time. So I just want to talk a little bit about the experience of, one example of an experience for a man who was sexually abused by a woman, by a female perpetrator. So this is a man who's currently in his 40s, and he was sexually abused by a female teacher, and it went on for quite some time. It went on between the ages of between 30 and 20. And it just points to, again, how some of those ideas about gender can really muddy up the waters in terms of even naming abuse for what it is, let alone making sense of it. So there's no audio, sorry. So I'll just read it out if people are unable to read it. I never thought of myself as the victim. I never felt there was anything sinister. I got enjoyment from it. I initiated it. It seems like it's different because I'm male. The social perception is that the male is the sexual aggressor. The penetrator is the aggressor. If it was a 14-year-old girl and an adult male, there would be no question. It does seem different. And part of the complexity there is there's a quite challenging article written by a queer theorist called Stephen Angelides, and he's writing about this kind of situation, and he's saying we need to be careful not to almost enter into brainwashing. There might be it's part of all of us probably saying yes, that clearly was abuse, and perhaps part of our role is to get to a point where it's much clearer for this man to name it as such. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad goal, but how do we do that? How do we have that conversation that doesn't pull the rug out from how that man currently understands it? And within the context of how discourses about masculinity are shaping his thinking. 2 minutes. I might just talk a little about the significance of the contexts in which men might get to the opportunity to make sense of sexual abuse.
The couple told me, I did talk to me, it feels good, you know, it feels like just a little big weight off my shoulders. You know. And it needs to happen more, but you know.
So as we'd all know, many men won't initially approach specialist sexual abuse counselling. They might approach a mental health service, a drug and alcohol counselling service, a whole range of other services. This man's sort of describing a little bit about the process for him, how he came to the point of naming sexual abuse.
When did I get diagnosed? This time, or about this week last year. Did my rehab in mid-November. And disclosed the incest sort of thing, and then that was reframed as abuse. And so my journey probably started November or December last year in terms of it being abuse, and that has enabled me to sort of grasp, to actually reprocess, because it wasn't something that was consciously in my mind. It was like a bit of a blank space, to be honest.
So I can sort of see really clearly how he's articulating the significance of the context to how the problem was named. You know, it went from a diagnosis, I think it was some kind of personality disorder, through to a drug and alcohol problem, through to naming the problem as sexual abuse. And what's clear from his story is that he encountered professionals who were alert to the fact that he may have been sexually abused. I've got time to do one more. Go on, he says. Yeah, so, sorry, this is just a nice reflection, I think, about, you know, I was a bit nervous about coming up after Stephen talking about the importance of, you know, this sort of need for thorough evaluation of services for victim survivors, and I thought, I wonder if this is just the kind of thing he's thinking about when he says that. But just a sort of illustration about, you know, this is one man's reflection about the process of making art, and how that contributed to his sense of himself, and it was in terms of the theme of control in his life. And he was really speaking about how this experience was something he was able to generalise into other areas of his life and relationships.
And then so I just did bits of things, and then just kept doing bits, and then all of a sudden those bits turn into something. And that was a real revelation for me. And fairly significant, I think, cognitively, to go, oh, so if I just do this thing, and just do this thing easily, and then I just do that thing easily, if I get to the end of 2 hours, something will be there, as opposed to trying to decide what to do.
Think at the end.
And then try and manifest it, which is typically what I'll do, and that's much harder. It's much more a cognitive sort of, it's a struggle then, because it's a bit like the guy who did the crocodile and stuff. It was like, I would do that if I could, because that's what I'm trying to do. But because I don't have that dexterity, it's such a struggle.
Thank you. And if anyone wants references or to follow up with anything, I'm quite happy to be contacted. And also a lot of the photos of the works are up on Anne Riggs's website. So if you're interested in sort of checking out some more photos, and some writing and reflections by some of the men are up there too. So thank you.